Hi, and welcome to this React Studio webinar. We're back, the team from Neonto, showing you some features for the latest update to React Studio. So today's topic will be about building a sign-up form. Sounds pretty simple, but there's actually quite a few interesting pieces here. We'll be using components to build a responsive layout that switches nicely between one column and two column modes depending on device size. Then we'll build the form, of course, play around with some styling, sending data to a plugin. We'll demonstrate some of the new plugins in React Studio that you can use to easily collect data. And then we'll take a look at how publishing and exporting from React Studio works. And this is the site we're going to build. It's the same site that you might have used already to sign up to this webinar. And this is what it looks like. So if we resize the window a bit, we can see that it switches neatly into a small mode, a narrow mode for phone size devices, and then to a two-column mode for larger devices. And over here we have a form using this nice material UI styling. And this, of course, is an email field. So if I enter something else than an email address, we can also get validation for this field. Let's start by taking a quick look at what the finished project looks like, and then I'll just jump in with the actual production. So here we have the project that was actually used to publish the webinar site I just showed you. We can see that there's really one screen, a couple of components, and then a few screens that we would see. This one, a thank you screen, and then there's an error screen that will display an error message if something goes wrong, and has a back button to take us back to the start screen. So let's see how we could build this one from scratch. We'll need a new project, of course. Let's go with this mobile first web app setup, since we do want the responsive design for this. This is actually a setting that you can change by screen basis, but of course it makes sense to start with the setting that we'll actually be using. So here we have the typical empty React Studio project, the app block, one empty screen. By default this screen is actually phone sized, but I think we'd like to do what we did on the original project and actually use a wider size as the base. This makes it a bit easier for us to start designing, so we don't have to design the portrait mode first, but we can start by this layout that we expect to be maybe a bit more common. It's easy to change, so we can click on the app settings block. Over here we have base format. Let's change that to iPad portrait, and here we are. And the next thing would be to bring in the background image. So let's go to where I keep my demo images. Should be this one. Yep, that looks right. And let's choose full screen. Just as a reminder, what this full screen setting actually does is that it will preset for us these alignments. So we can of course get the same effect for any image by simply enabling all these alignments. On every edge we want it to be aligned to the screen or containing component. We can move this into the background group just to make things a bit more clear. And then looking at the structure of this site, we have the two columns here. So the way to approach this is actually to have two components, but we can sketch it out first by just drawing a box, adding some text, and then figuring out how to go into components with those pieces. So let's draw a white box. This will be our sign up form. Let's also add some text. We can change the color to white. And I think the next one will be on May 25th. I hope you'll be joining us then, especially if you didn't make it to the live stream this time. We can maybe make this font a bit bigger like we had in the original. We'll align both these to the middle. Well, that's roughly it. And so far, of course, we don't have any responsiveness. So we can see that, well, our white box, it stays on exactly where we drew it. So on the phone size screen, it doesn't show up at all. On the tablet sizes, it ends up having a very different sized margin. So that's something we'll be using the columns element to fix. But first, to be able to use the columns element, which we can find here, we actually need to put these pieces into components. So let's select maybe these first, and the two texts, and we'll make a component out of these. And now we can see that they were merged into a component here, and a new component block has appeared over here. And let's do the same just for this white rectangle. Alright, here we have two components. And then to turn this into the column, what we can actually do is we can just take this out, dragging a new columns element. So far it says content not set. Let's first change the alignment a bit. Now we want this to extend the full width. And then let's go back to the element tab and choose this component for the other side and the white box for the other. And move it down a little bit. And that's our two columns. But as we can see in the preview, so far it still doesn't switch between one column and two column mode, but that's really easy to fix. Over here we have columns per row, so let's just click one for the narrow phone, okay, and also let's do the same for the wide phone. If we want to check out one of these closer, we can just double click and see what happens. Well, okay, here we see that there's a scroll overflow, but more interestingly, none of this is centered actually. So that's something we need to actually fix on the component level itself. Let's take a look at our two components over here. And just to make things a bit easier, I'll show you a trick to edit the component, this one directly. We can just double click on it and it takes us into component editing mode. So what we'd like to do here is make all these centered regardless of the container size. By default, a new component has the same size. It's not responsive. It has a single size on all screens. But here's a checkbox that lets us preview it at different sizes. We don't have to use that, but it's pretty useful. Let's add a keyline. The keyline shows up as one of these yellow diamond things, so we can drag it to a position, but we can also use the settings over here. Let's just put it at middle. Select these two and align them to the keyline by their center. And we can also make this a bit taller. Right. Then we can click on back to previous. And now we can see in our small view that, okay, the text is lined. And I think we need to do the same thing for our white box. What we really want here to happen is that it will basically fill the available space, leaving some margin. So let's go editing it. We can always scroll inside this little view, or you can click on the background to go to the project map view and find the component that way. So what we currently have here is simply just one white rectangle. That's all we drew. That was the element I had selected when I clicked on Make Component. What we can do here is simply make it a bit smaller, like this, and we should tell it to really align to every edge, also on the right. Something like this. And now I think it's a bit too tight here, so the easiest way to add more margin is simply that we can make this columns box narrower. We could also use a keyline for that, but since we only have this one element here with the columns, we can just eyeball it and drag it to a size that looks pretty decent. And next, let's see what we can do about the form that we're going to put over here. So going back to this component, what we really want to do is we don't need to use any of these groups here. We can keep everything in the foreground. We know this is going to be a fixed sized box containing the form. So what happens by default if I take an element here, for example a button, and I drop it there, it goes into the scroll flow group. Well, that's usually what we want, since it's pretty normal that we would like the layout to stretch like it typically does on a web page, but in this case we really want it to go over the white box in the foreground group. So we can always hold down the Alt key, Option key, and that will place it in the foreground group instead. Let's also add a keyline over here, same one as we had just for centering. And we want to add some text fields too. Again, dragging with Alt, Option key takes it to the right layer, group. Here we have a field. We can just duplicate that one to give us the other field. And let's add the little note about the that's the note that's above these boxes. Center that and choose all these, and we can use this align shortcut to center them on the keyline. Okay, nice. The default style for these fields is pretty boring. It's just the operating system default. But there's something called the UI framework plugin, which can be used to provide a more specialized look. So we'll enable that for both of these fields, and that's what will give us this nice material design styling, including these highlights and everything else that goes along with the expected look there. So the default UI framework plugin is called MUI, but this is really an open plugin system, so you'll be able to plug different styling frameworks to use instead of MUI if that's not appropriate for your project. Finally, we should remember to change this buttons label to sign up, and we need the placeholder texts. Your name and email. Let's change this field type to email address. That will give us some extra bit of validation on the field. And on a mobile phone, it will also give the right keyboard for typing email addresses, which is pretty useful. Yeah, so here we have the kind of basic skeleton for this. Let's take a look at this in the web browser. Before I do that, I'll just give this app some other name than my app. At this point, what happens is that the React project is created. It takes a while to put the files in the right place, collect all the packages, all that stuff. So let's see if our responsiveness works as we expect. Yep, it does. Compared to the one we have live on the site, there's quite a bit of styling missing. So let's next take a quick look at how we could give a bit more depth to this design. Shadows are a really useful way, and if we compare to the one we had here, we also have a kind of little effect on the background image. It's been darkened a little bit. So, and of course we should probably change the font if we want to be closer to the published one. This is the default system font. The one used here I think is called Source Sans. It's one of the fonts that actually is free to use and comes included with React Studio, so you can use it in your own projects without having to install anything extra. So let's change the font first. Back here in App Settings. I'll just open this so we can see the font change. So clicking on the App Settings block, here we can find the app styles. All these texts where we didn't change any of the style, they're still using the base text style. So we can just choose some other font for this. That should be Source Sans. Looks fine. Maybe we can make it a bit larger. This button font is called Action. Again, let's choose Source Sans there. And finally we have this element here, which has a custom font, so we do need to go change it out here. We'll make it a bold and maybe, yes, quite a bit larger, that's fine. Maybe we'll give it some extra room. Okay, so much for the fonts. Then we would like to have a shadow for this white box. So let's go see how we can make that happen. While I'm here, I'll fix the layout a little bit. Let's just move this down so it looks a bit nicer. So selecting this white box, we can find the effects here for this graphic, vector graphics. The only one that's offered is shadow, and then some other ones like corner radius, but in this case we'll just add a maybe this default soft shadow is fine. We can also change it to custom to maybe make it a bit darker. Let's just first see how this one looks. I think we need to add some margin just so that the shadow fits nicely. Okay, that's the box shadow there. For these texts, I think we also had a shadow in the original to make them pop out a little bit against the background. Let's go change that as well. So here with the font settings we can also find the same shadow setting here. Let's just use the same one of these presets for both of these. And that's it. And finally we'd like to do something for the background. So the thing that was done here was to darken the image, and it's actually possible to edit images in place inside React Studio. If we double click on this element, we'll be taken into what's called the element contents editing mode, and here we can see the original image, which since we're using this crop alignment back in the layout, so the original image is actually this size, and this is the visible portion. So what we could do is simply make a box that's maybe black with 20% opacity, and we can just draw this box over the whole thing, and now we have darkened the background, and we could really draw anything into the element contents editing mode to modify the image. But for this case, I think we're happy with this. Let's click on open in web browser again, and check out our new version. Okay. That seems pretty fine. And well, the next thing to do, since we now have the styling pretty much in place, of course, compared to the original, it has a bit more text. It has a logo here. Let's not bother with everything. Well, we could change actually this button color. That's an interesting one. So it's part of the app settings over here in app styles, and just as we use the action font to change the action text style to change the font for the button, we can change the action color. And really these are the defaults, so we would always be able to override these for like an individual button, but for now let's just go with the with using these styles. It's pretty convenient to be able to change them in one place when we want to. Okay, that seems fine. So now that we have the form in place, the next thing to do really would be to figure out how we can actually send this data somewhere. So here we come to the question of working with data plugins in React Studio. What we want to happen is that when the user clicks on this button, the data gets collected from these elements and sent to a plugin. So let's select with the button selected. Let's go over here to interact. Here we find settings. When user taps this button, we have the various interaction settings, go to, we can run a script, we can reveal or hide other elements, but update data is the one we want to use. And for update data, there are three kinds of targets. We can send data into a data sheet, save it to a data slot, or we can use a plugin. And that's going to be what we'll use here. And as it says, no targets in this project, we need to go over here to data plugin setup using this shortcut. It's also possible to access data plugin setup from using the data tab, but this is of course pretty convenient when we're already doing the interaction. So here we have the list of plugins that are included in the default installation for this latest React Studio version. Generic JSON, Google Sheets, MailChimp, send email, and then some data fetching. We could fill out lists using data from Tumblr or WordPress posts or an RSS feed. But for our purposes, the interesting ones here would be we could use send email, or we could use the MailChimp plugin to add this user name and email to a MailChimp list, which is a pretty convenient way to collect the data in one place and have it ready for contacting these people later. So let's click add down here, add a MailChimp plugin. And now we can see that, okay, here under MailChimp we got one plugin. We can rename it, send to just so that we know that what's going to be the point of this action. And over here we have the settings for the plugin. So each plugin can create its own little user interface to be shown here. And there's a little help text. And then we need to enter something called a client key. And that's because the MailChimp plugin actually is using a service called API Bridge, which is made by us. Neonto is a really simple tool for connecting your React Studio projects to backends without having to write server code. Let's take a look at the API Bridge and see how that works. So this is the Neonto API Bridge. When you subscribe to React Studio, you have been given an access key that you can use to access this service. And as we add more APIs, this list will grow. So far, we only have settings here for send email, Google Sheets, MailChimp. But hey, you have to start somewhere. So it's definitely something that we expect to grow. If you have ideas for services you'd like to see added, let us know. It might be pretty easy. So let's think about for a second about why we actually need this API bridge. What MailChimp gives us is an API key, which is not displayed here, but it's been saved in the API bridge. So why don't we just use this MailChimp key directly in our React Studio app? Well, the thing with these API keys is you can usually do quite a lot with them, and we may not want to have that key available in the client-side web app, because when it's a web app, even though the JavaScript has been compiled, someone can still go into the code and look up the key. If we have the original MailChimp key in the React Studio app code, it's a security risk. So the API bridge is kind of an insulation between your original key and what React Studio sees. So what we can would do here, I've entered my API key, and it will then give us a client key. Well, I've hidden it for this demo, but the client key would be something like it's a series of numbers, so we can just enter something to pretend it's the client key here. So that would be the key that gets used for this API to without exposing your original MailChimp key. And just taking a quick look, we also have the same thing happens with the send email and also Google Sheets plugin. The original data is protected by the API bridge, and you have additional settings. For example, for send email, you can list the email addresses that are permitted to receive mail, so this prevents any spamming using your React app. And same goes for Google Sheets. There's a separate admin page for this, but what you can do there is specify which sheets can be accessed for reading and writing, so the rest of your Google data stays safe. And back here, we created the MailChimp plugin instance, so now we can choose it here in the list. And the plugin can also show a little interface for each action, which is of course pretty important here, because what we really want to do is to be able to, for this button, we want to be able to tell this specific action to take the content from these two elements. And that's what the MailChimp plugin does. It offers us an interface here that allows us to specify these things. Let's take a quick look. First, we need to give it a mailing list ID. This is something we would get from the MailChimp settings. That's going to be the ID for the mailing list where we would send this. Then we have a setting for take value email address from an element or a data slot. Well, in this case, we'll just take it from an element. Using a data slot would be pretty convenient. For example, if we already had a login for the user, so our React app knows the user email address already, then we could just take it from a data slot. In this case, let's actually give these elements more useful names. Now they're just called field and field copy. So we'll call this one name, and this one is email. And going back to the button, so this one comes from the email field, and the username value will similarly come from the name field. And then we have a few more settings. On success, we can go to a specific screen, or if there's an error, if adding to the mailing list fails, we'll go to another screen. Let's just create these screens just so we can see what happens. We'll call this the error one. Let's make it roughly like the one we had in the other project. We'll give it a dark background. Add some text here. We'll also add a field text element for displaying the error message. So this is actually something that's sort of by convention. What the plugin will do is it will fill out a property called error text when it enters this screen. So as long as we link this text element to a property called error text, it will display the real error that came from the server or plugin. So over here in the data tab, we'll specify that the text content for this element should be taken from a property named error text. And that's it. Now we can see that, okay, the property name appears here, and there's the little connector line here that shows that, well, this is the element that will show that properties contents. And finally, let's go back to, let's actually duplicate this one just to make sure that, make the success version of this. So to duplicate, all I did was press Command and D. You can find these commands here in the edit menu as well. And over here, obviously, we don't need an error text. We can just add something else. One thing I actually forgot from my error screen is that we should have a button to take the user back to the actual form. Let's just add here a button that says go back. And we need to, of course, have the interaction for that one to be go back. Right. I'll just change the placeholder for this so we know that that's where the error text will appear. And finally, let's connect these back here, clicking the button, going back to the settings we had for this plugin. So on success, we want to go to the screen named success, otherwise we'll go to the one named error. And now, clicking back to the project map, well, we see that, okay, here the connector lines have appeared. So from this component contains actions that can take us to either one of those screens. And that's really it. So what's going to happen now is, since I entered junk for the keys, the client key for the MailChimp plugin as well as the list ID, when we actually try this, we'll probably get an error from the server telling us that, hey, this is not a valid key. Let's try this in the browser. But first, actually, let's leave this email field empty, just so that we can see something interesting. So what happens here is, without the email address, we actually got into this screen that says, please fill in your email address. That error came from the MailChimp plugin itself. So the plugin does some little validation. It knows that, okay, the element that was named as email element should contain something that looks like a valid email address and won't proceed without it. Now we have something there. Let's click on sign up, and well, we got a server error, which is to be expected since we didn't have the right key there. But yeah, that's if we just dropped in the right key, then we would have a working app for this. Let's quickly take a look at what if we wanted to not use MailChimp, but instead have this send us just a personal email. So this is one of the nice things about the plugin system, it's that it's really easy to change actions to something else. So we could use the send email plugin instead. Again, we need a client key. We need to specify who's going to send this. So in this case, we would basically be sending to ourselves. And then we'll just change this action to use the email plugin instead. And what we have here in the email plugin looks pretty familiar. We can take the text content from an element or data slot. We can take the subject line from a data slot or enter it here. And for the to email address, we can also enter it here. So in this case, we probably want to send an email to ourselves with the data collected from the form. And let's look back to our agenda. Really, one remaining item. Well, publishing. We already used the open in web browser feature. Let's do a mobile preview with. Oh, sorry. Let's use the publish to web feature just to see how that works. So if we wanted to go live with this dinky little site, we could put it on our Neontos server. Let's just give it a site name. And click on publish. The app gets built and optimized. So what happens when we're publishing or exporting is that instead of a development build, which is what we had here, we're going to get an optimized build. And the publishing is ready, so we have a site URL on our neonto.cloud server using the name that we gave there. So let's copy that to the clipboard, go take a look. And that's it, that's the site. And actually, if you want to use the publish feature and you want to have a custom domain name, custom URL, we're really happy to help you set that up. So if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to contact. Our email is hello@neonto.com. And finally, let's take a quick look at the React code from this project. So clicking on export, we can specify a package name, version code. We'll just keep these as they are. And over here in exported projects, we now have the project I just exported. This structure follows the Facebook's create React app scaffolding. So these are basically very close to the structure that you would get building it from scratch. There's really nothing extra here. We have the components in JavaScript. We have the CSS that came from the UI framework. The fonts were copied here in place. We have the images that were used here, so all we have is the background image. And of course we have the code for these components. Let's take a look at one of these, for example. Well, looks like I didn't give any very interesting names to these components. So I think comp2 is actually this one I have open here, the sign up form. And there we have it. there really isn't much extra here. This is very basic React. One of the things we really try to ensure in React Studio is that the exported code looks nice, that we don't include extra junk or use IDs for elements or variables that would make it look like this was generated using a tool. So we want the code you get from React Studio to be useful as a starting point for your programming project. So just looking here, actually what happens with the this sign up button. So we have the button here, and there's an when we connected the data plugin, it actually got all this on-click code was generated by the plugin using the input that we provided here in the interface that the plugin gave itself in a way. So that's really the strength of React Studio plugins, is that they can do these rather deep and complex customizations inside the UI, and then use that to build write clean code into the exported project. So what I have actually here open in the other window, this is the code for the MailChimp plugin. Plugins for React Studio, they're written in JavaScript, and if you want to explore the code, you can go to the plugin manager and you click here show plugins folder, and there you'll find all the plugins in the default installation, and you can just go inside and take a look at all these source files. So for every plugin there's a main JS. I won't get too deep here, but just taking a quick look, there's some functions that provide information about the plugin, drawing the icon, giving it a description. Then there's some data for the plugin. Here's the part that's most interesting probably for about the MailChimp plugin, is this user interface that's provided for each action. So it's really provided in the action context. Taking a look back here, if we add a second button, we can have different settings, of course, for that button. So the plugin is able to build user interfaces for a specific context. In this case, it's called the send data action. And finally, what we have here is a function that gets called by React Studio to actually write out the code that ends up in the exported project. And what our plugin does here is that it asks for these element names, element accessor code, which is used to get the value of an element. It asks for data slot accessor code, and switches between these and writes these to a little template. And the template here is a separate file, and this is really the JavaScript that gets written into the React project using the values that are filled by the plugin based on what was specified here in React Studio. So this, you can think of this as sort of providing a let's say next generation level of type safety, because we've isolated a lot of these details of how this API is implemented behind an interface that where the designer or whoever is using this tool can actually only make the choices that the plugin author wanted to be available. And that's pretty big, because in a way we've now encapsulated the process of all these error-prone things, like what actually happens when the fetch request is sent. All of that is now neatly packaged behind a more visual and designer-friendly user interface. But still, the code we get is as clean as if it were written by somebody manually. So that's what we call higher order programming, and it's really a big part of what React Studio can do when you kind of embrace the plugin ecosystem. And for now, like I showed, we only have a couple of plugins here working, but we're really working hard to expand this range. What we're going to do next is build up our WordPress REST API support to support many more actions than just loading posts. That's something we'll be building up on a short term. And of course, since the code for these, as I mentioned, is available on your own system, what you can always do is you can just take a copy of one of these and start hacking away if you want to support some other service. And just as a quick mention, there are of course other types of plugins, not just web services, but you can also create custom elements, basically wrapping either existing React components or writing your own template to write a React component. And these, for example, this rating plugin that comes in the default installation, what it actually does is it packages an existing well-known component called React Rating and pulls that code from npm at build time. So it really is no different than using the component how you would normally do it as a programmer, except here it's being packaged behind this nice UI. Well, that's pretty much everything I had this time around. We're planning to have another webinar in 2 weeks from now. Of course, looks like I forgot to update the date over there. Oh well. So the next one will be on the 25th May. I hope to see you again then, and if you have any questions, you can always send them us by email. So our email address is hello@neontalk.com. Thanks very much for joining this webinar, and see you soon.